Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock, episode 311. This week the questions are taken from guide 387, that's on the Delaware class battleships of the US Navy, as well as the Wednesday video on the Western Australia Maritime Museum. So let's get on with questions. BK Zhong asks, did anyone try to make a fast battleship in the sense of a big gun capital ship that doesn't sacrifice either firepower or armour in exchange for speed in the pre-dreadnought era? Not really. They would have dearly loved to, but the technological limitations of the pre-dreadnought era, particularly when it comes to the total output of vertical triple expansion engines versus the relative size of pre-dreadnought battleships, their length to beam ratios and their armament capacities, etc., just doesn't lend itself to the idea of a fast battleship in that period. I mean, for that matter, without making the ships excessively large relative to the graduation of development, it also precludes getting fast battleships in the first decade to decade and a half of the dreadnought era. You essentially need the power plant's power output to be high enough, but their floor space to be small enough in order to fit an acceptable power plant, that can get you up to a high speed relative to ships at the time without having to make an absolutely gargantuan hull. And you can look even at Hood, which gets the protection of battleships 3-4 years older than her at the time of design, which is a couple of generations back at that time period. But to get that protection and firepower on the speed that arguably could potentially turn her into a fast battleship, she needs to be colossally larger. And that's with actually several improvements in propulsion technology that have occurred or been implemented in between. In the pre-dreadnought era, the margins are far closer, and so it's just not possible. You've got things like the Regina Elena class, which is the one on display in the picture here, which does have decent protection and for its time period a high speed. 22 knots for a pre-dreadnought battleship is well in excess of the average of 18, but as you might be able to tell, she has sacrificed some firepower for that by only having single instead of twin turrets. Now, there is a very, very small margin where you could potentially argue that some armoured cruisers towards the end of the pre-dreadnought era sort of could be used as fast battleships because they have speed, obviously, relative to pre-dreadnoughts, and they have the armament and armour that, technically speaking, match up to certain battleships of the pre-dreadnought era. But that's really stretching matters, because you think of things like the Minotaur or Scharnhorst classes of obviously the German and Royal Navies, or Georgios Averof of the Hellenic or Greek Navy. But the Minotaurs and Scharnhorsts are built right at the end of the pre-dreadnought era, just as it turns into the dreadnought era, and Averof is built well into the dreadnought era. And the ships that you'd be looking at to compare their protection and firepower to say they're technically on a par with some battleships, are built well back in the 1890s. So you're looking at things like the Canopus class, which perhaps goes a little bit overboard on the advantages of Krupp steel and only has a 6-inch belt. And then combining that with something like the Kaiser Friedrich III or Wittelsbach class battleships, which only have 4 9.4-inch guns, at which point the 4 9.2-inch guns on the Minotaurs and Georgios Averof, they kind of look okay. And of course, Averof is slightly better protected than the Canopuses and almost as well protected as a Wittelsbach. But the gulf in time and technology between those three types of armoured cruiser and those pre-dreadnoughts really makes the whole thing rather unfair. albeit that thanks to the Ottoman Navy not having anything more advanced than old predreadnoughts, you can kind of actually see Georges Avroff being used in a way like a fast battleship in the various conflicts between the Greeks and the Turks in the early 1910s. Reginald Pessoa, I think, asks, would it have made sense for the US Navy to forward deploy older battleships or second-line cruisers in the Philippines to deter Japanese aggression, especially as Japan ramped up their war in China, as a show of force and as a deterrence or first line of defence against a naval invasion of the Philippine Islands? Unfortunately, not really, for three main reasons. Firstly, the US doesn't have anywhere near the logistical capacity in their Philippine naval bases as they existed to support a significant sized fleet, as in, 5 or 6 battleships and half a dozen cruisers or something like that, plus, of course, attendant destroyers, at least on a long-term basis, plus, of course, all the other ships that would be needed that would be associated with a fleet like that. So they would have to make quite significant investments in upgrading the facilities in the Philippines first, and then they could potentially look at deploying the ships. But that runs into a second issue, which is effectively that would be handing the Japanese everything they wanted on a plate, because a relatively small force like that, the Japanese simply, by the mid to late 1930s, aren't going to respect. They're not going to view it as a particular deterrence, because essentially they have more faster and better capital ships than that kind of force, plus obviously a lot of aircraft carriers, and with their penchant for opening wars with surprise attacks, which technically speaking shouldn't have been a surprise, because literally everybody knew that was probably what they were going to do, since they'd done it in basically every modern war they'd fought, that being obviously not too many of them, but twice as a pattern. The Japanese Navy would have just gone, perfect, we can either cut off and isolate or ideally destroy a significant portion of the US battle fleet without really much risk to ourselves, prior to engaging the rest of the US fleet on parity basis, which essentially cuts out the whole multiple attacks as the US fleet makes its way across before fighting the decisive battle part of the Kantai-Kessen Doctrine. But from a Japanese perspective, this is fantastic, because it means if the US Navy does then go to war with them, well, they can use submarines and aircraft to cripple and destroy pretty much the entirety of any force in the Philippines, and harass and destroy any survivors pretty easily as well. And then when the rest of the US fleet comes to the rescue, or tries to, then those harassment attacks by destroyers and cruisers, the Congos and the aircraft carriers, will, instead of reducing the US Navy's numerical superiority to parity, will be reducing an approximate parity down to a substantial Japanese superiority, which actually makes the war far easier for them. Essentially, it plays into the Japanese hands, because a show of force or deterrence only works if your enemy actually cares about the force you're using to deter them. And the Japanese pretty much didn't, or wouldn't in this case. Theoretically, there may be some margin on paper in putting very old, obsolete ships into the Philippine area in order to act as a first line of defense, but unfortunately, the treaties in the interwar period pretty much have removed that capability from the US Navy, because obviously they are now limited in what they can have in terms of battleships and cruisers, etc. So they've had to essentially keep what they want for active battle line duty. They don't have significant reserves of older ships, whereas perhaps in the past that would have made more sense, because then you could have taken something like, let's say if they still had the South Carolinas or the Floridas sitting somewhere in mothballs, you could potentially send them over to the Philippines, or maybe something like the Pennsylvania class armored cruisers, and park them almost like the Germans did to Tirpitz at the end, essentially park them in very, very shallow water, build up some sandbars around them so they can't capsize, and now you have pretty much perfect floating, or just about floating, fortresses. That would, perhaps supplementing Fort Drum, make things a lot more difficult for any potential invasion, assuming you could cover them with enough anti-aircraft guns and or put some airfields full of fighters nearby. But with the Washington treaties, all those ships had long ago been scrapped, so they just didn't have ships that they could afford to expend that way. Patrick Landis asks, what was different about USS Delaware that allowed her to steam ahead longer than other Dreadnought-class ships of her time in the US Navy? I read somewhere that she was the first in the US Navy to be able to go full ahead for 24 hours plus without suffering a breakdown, but I don't remember reading why that was so. This was because Delaware had the most advanced engines for long-distance cruising in the US Navy at the time. So prior to her introduction in the US Navy, the vast majority of US Navy capital ships are equipped with vertical triple expansion engines or some related technology thereunto. And of course her sister at North Dakota has turbines. However, we're in an era before the geared turbines, so these are direct drive turbines, which means that therefore North Dakota's turbines are going to be overall, given that they're not going to be run at maximum speed all the time, somewhat less efficient. Therefore, on the same fuel load, she can only go a portion of the distance that Delaware can. So that leaves Delaware competing with the other vertical triple expansion engine powered ships for a distance record. And specifically, obviously, then you said about going 24 hours plus without suffering engine breakdown. Now, here is where the difference between Delaware and the other vertical triple expansion engine ships comes in. The older ships had the normal gravity-fed lubrication systems that all vertical triple expansion engines pretty much had at the time. Delaware, however, introduced forced lubrication under pressure. Now, this is obviously a slightly more complicated system because it involves another set of machinery that could potentially break, and it does make the environment within the engine room, shall we say, even less welcoming than a normal vertical triple expansion engine room, because, as we mentioned before in other videos, if you're in a vertical triple expansion engine room that's going full pelt, you're basically in a sauna, except the sauna is not just made up of hot steam, it's also made up of hot spraying oil everywhere, which is why you need to constantly top up the lubrication system on a vertical triple expansion engine. Otherwise, things start to seize up and everything goes a bit haywire. And of course, under a gravity-fed system, there can be patches of an engine running at high speed where the lubrication just doesn't get to for a little bit, because there'll be very tight tolerances and it's going pretty quickly, so things like surface tension and so forth might delay the arrival of your lubricating oils, which can then cause friction, which will then cause issues which will potentially eventually end up causing breakdowns. And there's a whole other raft of issues as well, but that's some of the very, very basic stuff. Whereas with forced lubrication, you are almost literally pumping the oil into pretty much every nook and cranny, whether you like it or not, as an engine. But of course, oil can and does escape, which is, as we said, is why you have to keep feeding the stuff in. So on the one hand, you have the advantage that because Delaware's engines are now essentially always lubricated all the time, they can run for considerably longer before just build-up of heat and stress and so forth will eventually force you to shut them down. The flip side to that is that you better be wearing some fairly heavy-duty coveralls when you're in there, because the whole place is going to be dripping with hot oil and condensation by the time you're finished. Which is why the forced lubrication vertical triple expansion engine didn't leapfrog the turbine. The turbine just got geared turbines to improve its efficiency, and then everyone went over to them. Scott Giles asks, if Hitler had sent the first wave of V1 bombs against the invasion fleet at Normandy, how effective would it have been? Navies were pretty good at putting up anti-aircraft fire by June 1944, so it might not have been as one-sided as some people think. Well, it would have been very, very one-sided. It would have been a complete and utter waste of V1s, because historically speaking, the V1 offensive didn't begin until not quite, but almost a week after the D-Day landings occurred, which means that the Germans really don't actually have that many V1s at the beginning of June 1944. So they have a limited number, and then they're launching these things, but they have a CEP, circular error probability, i.e., the area in which they're likely to hit at this point, which is, roughly speaking, a 20-mile diameter circle. This presents something of a problem, because if you target the landing forces on the beaches, that means that, statistically speaking, 50% of all the V1s you launch are going to drop onto northern France, which means you have, roughly speaking, an equally high chance of hitting your own defences as you do the invasion forces. And then, of course, you have to factor in, as you said, anti-aircraft guns, Allied fighter cover, which was quite extensive. So you launch your very small cadre of V1s. A bunch of those will either get shot down by fighters, by anti-aircraft guns. They might malfunction. Some of them did. And then your tiny number of V1s that have actually now made it over the Normandy beaches, or roughly that area, half of those are going to start blowing up random French countryside or your own defences. The other half that actually fall onto the area in which there are actually enemy targets, at which point we might be down to as many as you can count on a couple of hands. Well, if you actually look at the photos of Operation Neptune and Operation Overlord, even at their absolute densest packing, the ships are still scattered over a very, very, very wide area. We're talking 90% or more. 90% would be really, really generous to the V1s, probably more like 95 to 97%, or possibly even higher, of the area where the enemy approximately are, is just open sea. Which means that, statistically, you are unlikely to actually hit anything of the enemies with your V1s. You will blow up a bunch of fish and possibly scare a bunch of people, but scoring any actual direct hits on any of the invasion force would be a statistical outlier, not anything that you could actually guarantee. And if you did, well, okay, yeah, whatever got hit would probably be in a bad way, but considering that the Allies did lose a few ships to mines and the occasional torpedo and so forth, realistically speaking, it's going to be, if anything, a slightly interesting data point of, oh yeah, and also we lost one ship to this weird pilotless bomb that showed up, and that's really about it. And given that the V1 is not an armor-piercing weapon, it's just a big blast weapon, even then it might not actually do all that much. If it hits Texas or Warspite or something like that, yeah, it'll cause some damage, but it's not going to sink it. Admittedly, if it hits an LST or a LSI or something like that, yeah, there could be some fairly major casualties, but now you're going into, a single-digit number of V1s, which by statistics aren't actually going to hit anything, but by some fluke they do hit something, and then by some fluke again they actually hit something that's relatively thin-skinned and full of infantry, and that's really probably the best you can hope for. Yeah, it's really not going to change anything about the Normandy invasion. I mean, over the course of the few days after the invasion, the Germans did actually manage to drop a lot more aerial mines with considerably more accuracy into the area where the invasion was taking place, and achieved basically diddly squat with them as well. JBPA asks, you mentioned that Turret 3 on Delaware was unable to fire rearward for fear of damaging Turret 4's sights with the blast wave. Why is this not a concern for other super-firing turrets? Are there preventative measures that could not be taken on Delaware's rear turrets for one reason or another? Essentially, it all comes down to placement. So here is part of the stern of Delaware. Now you can see Turret 3 there, merrily sitting above 4 and 5. But hopefully you can immediately see the problem, because if you remember the blast wave map that I've shown several times before, admittedly that's from a 16-inch 50 gun on an Iowa class, but you get the general drift, because the only thing that's going to change really about that is the exact pressure at various markers. But you can see that poor old Turret 4 here is in its default position facing at turret 3 and vice versa, and turret 4 cannot actually traverse all the way around to fire aft because, well, turret 5 is in the way. This means that if turret 3 fires directly aft, in this position, the maximum strength of the blast of her guns is going to be going straight into the sights of turret 4, which has its sights turned towards the blast, so it's going to be even worse. And even if you rotate turret 4 to aim as far back as possible, you're not really changing all that much other than the fact that the sights are facing away, so there'll be a very slight reduction in the shockwave that hits the sights, but not a huge amount. The general overpressure is still going to be there. Now, if you compare that with, say, Delaware's forward turrets, you'll notice that obviously, firstly, turret 1 is facing away from turret 2, which, as we said, helps, especially because it's directly away. But also, although you can just about see the sighting hood up on turret 1 here, if you, again, remember that blast diagram, the initial pressure wave coming out of the guns is in a fairly narrow cone that then widens as it goes. So if we assume that the guns are, well, even if they're dead straight like this, but assuming they're even elevated a tiny bit, then there's not enough distance between the muzzle of the guns, in this case on turret 2, and where the sights are, for that really intense pressure wave to actually spread out enough to really impact and damage or destroy the sights on turret 1. Whereas back aft, there is more than enough distance for that pressure wave to spread out. And here's that diagram from the Iowa's guns that I mentioned. So if you can imagine, obviously these pressure waves reduced somewhat in, and factor in that the sights do have a degree of pressure resistance, hopefully you can see why turret 4 is in a particularly uniquely badly placed position as far as turret 3 firing directly over its head is concerned. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, "You've explained why torpedoes have a round head versus a pointy head. However, whenever we've looked at the fastest fish in the world, sailfish, marlins, makos, barracudas, all of them have pointy heads. The sailfish and marlin in particular seem to have a head that is specifically designed, in spite of all the hydrodynamic rules you've outlined, yet they are some of the fastest fish on the planet. What's their bioengineering secret, and why couldn't anyone in the channel's time period replicate it?" Well, the body plan of a sailfish or marlin is obviously very different to the body plan of a torpedo, and when it comes to hydrodynamics, it's equally, if not more important, as how you release the water that's traveling alongside you, as it is how you get the water out of the way in the first place. And of course, when you look at these fish, they have a different hydrodynamic plan. Also, obviously, they move through the water in a different way. They have to propel themselves with the side-to-side motion of their tails, which involves most of their body going back and forth all the time, which is a whole other set of propulsion and hydrodynamic equations compared to a torpedo, which just hopefully moves through the water in a relatively straight line with spinning propellers at the back. But additionally, if you actually superimpose a torpedo profile over any one of these fish or other fast fish as well, you'll notice that actually, generally speaking, their body profile does conform to torpedo-like specifications. You see, around the forward fins, and then the head actually curves in quite quickly, forming pretty much the blunt nose of a torpedo. The only exception being on these particular types of fish, they obviously have this very long, very slender bill that protrudes still further, which is a very different thing as compared to looking at something like a whitehead torpedo, which has a almost continuous curve flaring out, almost cone-like nose. And in these particular fishes' case, the bill is more an adaptation for feeding, although there is a small amount of hydrodynamic benefit it would get from disrupting the water ahead of time, but essentially it's such a small, narrow profile that it doesn't massively increase the surface area at the front end of the fish the way that a whitehead torpedo or similar era torpedo with a more cone-like head would. And then when you look at other fish that are quite fast, like a Dorado or a tuna, they're almost as fast as these, you'll notice far more conventional, if you like, much blunter heads, which allow them, as I said, to go pretty much almost as fast, with a body plan that, whilst obviously built for speed, is nowhere near as finely tuned for speed as something like a marlin or a sailfish. The thing is, if you took this body plan of the marlin or sailfish and reduced its beak down to the point where it had a more tuna-like facial profile and therefore much closer to what we think of as a torpedo, they would probably go slightly faster. The only problem is at that point they would have great difficulty feeding, which is a bit of a downside when it comes to being a living creature. William Potts asks, Drach, will you at some point talk about the risks of transporting certain cargoes such as grain and coal? Yes, well, there are a lot of risks involved in moving that kind of cargo, but they're not necessarily always the same kind of risks as you might think of when you're transporting or storing that kind of cargo on land. Of course, grain silos are known for occasionally randomly exploding, which you wouldn't initially think they should do, but it turns out that when it's relatively dry, anything that's granular and particularly powder-like, which you can get quite a lot of powder off grain, that generates friction by being moved around can cause fire and explosion effects through rapid deflagration. Chocolate, cocoa powder storage bins, flour storage bins, especially vulnerable to this kind of thing. Coal dust as well can have the same problem. Now, at sea, having your cargo, if it's grain or coal or similar, randomly explode is actually considerably less of a risk, because although you're not directly exposing the stuff to the sea, you are nevertheless in a relatively moist air environment, and therefore that has a little bit of a dampening effect on the finest of dusts, which are the most explosives. However, you do run other risks. With grain and anything like grain that you might be transporting, one of the single largest risks is that ideally, from an efficiency perspective, the best way to transport it is in very large cargo holds. But if the ship starts to pitch or roll particularly heavily in bad weather, there is a fairly decent chance that the cargo will also shift, and shift in fairly large quantities. That can at best risk putting your ship out of trim if you are pitching rather heavily. At worst, it can lead to capsizing if you're rolling quite heavily, because unlike liquid, which could in theory do the same thing if you had partially filled, let's say, oil tanks, grain and other similar things like that won't immediately shift back. You've tipped it so far, you've overcome the loose binding that the various grains have. It all shifts. Now you've got this massive weight on the one side, but you have to have a similar level of force that's going to bring your ship back the other way before that grain will shift again. And that means you have a prolonged period where you have a huge weight on one side, which could then cause your next roll to be even worse, which will cause even more grain to shift, and suddenly you're on your side, and that's pretty much all you wrote. The other thing, of course, is that with liquid cargo, like oil tanks, you can actually fill your tank up to pretty much the maximum, which means that whilst in theory the liquid might be moving around, from an balance perspective, it's not actually really changing its center of gravity all that much. Whereas with stuff like grain, you can't really fill your holes right up to the very brim, at least certainly in the time period the channel covers, because that makes things like, well, getting it out in the first place when you get to shore rather difficult, but also grain and any other similar cargo like that tends to stack itself into a natural cone, and it's a lot of faff and work to try and redistribute that. So that means there's actually a lot more clear space for cargo to shift when it comes to stuff like grain. There is a technically similar risk with coal, but it's much less likely to happen because coal comes in larger lumps, and of more irregular shapes and sizes. Therefore, it's less likely to get wholesale movement of coal unless something's gone seriously wrong, but it can happen. But the other big problem with coal is, especially with lower grades of coal, if it gets wet, then you can get reactions in the coal, partly because of impurities, which can then send temperatures soaring, which can then cause the coal to spontaneously ignite, and then you have coal fires, which of course are now in the middle of coal, which is a fuel, and that can get very, very bad very, very quickly. Coal fires could and did happen semi-regularly in bunkers of ships, and even then that could be an issue. It's fairly likely that a coal fire, or at least the heating preceding a coal fire, probably caused the loss of USS Maine as opposed to a Spanish mine. But if you are a collier, when upwards of 50% of your overall displacement or more might be coal, and it's in really big storage bunkers like this British collier you can see here, that fire has the potential to spread a lot more, which obviously can be much more disastrous for the ship. And of course, it's also your paying cargo, as opposed to on a warship where it's quote-unquote only what's supposed to get you from point A to point B. King Brock asks, you've mentioned subs getting maintenance on a slipway. How was that done? Was it a massive winch and rollers? And why wasn't this used for larger ships as an alternative to drydocks? Essentially, yeah, pretty much. You either build a frame and sail the submarine up to the frame a little bit off the slipway, or you just have the slipway designed for it with the appropriate receiving cradles and so forth. But in any case, whatever happens, you get the sub onto some kind of towable cradle, and then you use something, whether that be a bunch of vehicles, or a crane, or a massive winch, usually a massive winch, to haul the thing up the slipway, whereupon you can, of course, conduct maintenance like this. This is a German submarine in 1940 in Lorient in France, and you can absolutely guarantee this submarine was not built in Lorient in France in 1940. It was built 4 years earlier in Germany. So what's it doing up on the slipway? Well, it's being maintained. As for why this wasn't used for larger ships, there's three primary reasons. Firstly, submarines in World War II, well, World War I for that matter, but in this particular example, World War II, are considerably lighter than almost any other major surface warship, which means that, the winch setup that can haul, in this case, a few hundred tons of Type 7 up will not be able to haul 10,000 tons of treaty-era cruiser or 35,000 tons of treaty battleship up the slipway. And related to that, there is a moment of tension on the underside, compression on the top, of any ship as it enters or leaves a slipway, which can cause deformation of the hull. And of course, if it's something like a submarine, which doesn't weigh all that much, comparatively speaking, and has a very strong pressure hull, and obviously being a cylindrical pressure hull, one that is strengthened all the way around, that means because of the lower stresses and the better capability of coping with those stresses, hauling a submarine up onto a slipway where it's going to be, for a time, subjected to a buoyancy force trying to lift its stern, whilst obviously the bow isn't going anywhere because it can't be pressed further into the slipway, that a submarine can withstand, a ship not so much. That's why slipway ship launches tend to be as quick as possible. And the other thing is balance. So when you build a sub, obviously pretty much the entire sub just goes straight into the water, and that's pretty much it. But also when you think about where the center of gravity and the center of balance is on a submarine, even when it's surfaced, a good chunk of the submarine is usually underwater. So that means its balance point is quite low down. And that means when you bring it up, it's going to be pretty stable. A ship, compared to a submarine, proportionally has a significantly greater amount of its mass and volume above the water, therefore its center of balance, center of gravity, etc. is higher, and therefore there's more chance of it falling over. Plus, of course, when ships are launched, for various reasons, including weight, but also stability, they tend not to have the big heavy stuff like armoured gun turrets, the guns, most of the superstructure installed. Whereas if you tried to haul the ship up after all that had been installed, it would be even more top heavy and even more likely to roll over. So yeah, those are the main reasons why it's much more efficient and indeed safe and possible to haul a submarine of this time period up out of the water. And most of those even still apply to submarines these days, even if they do weigh a bit more. Matthew Miller asks, hypothetically, if the US collectively realises what a tragedy scrapping USS Enterprise was and makes it a mission to save Yorktown, raising her to the surface, I believe, is possible with the technology we have today. It would be an endeavour of applied science and technology, manpower and resources on the scale of the Apollo program, but it could be done. Now that she's back on the surface and into dry dock, my question is this. Though she is in remarkable condition now, it is my understanding that she would rapidly deteriorate once she's out of the water. So do we currently have the chemical, physical and procedural knowledge to stop the corrosion and restore her without turning her into a ship of Theseus? Maybe. The biggest questions that you would have to answer in this kind of scenario would be how much damage has been caused to the hull by her actually hitting the seabed, because there's a difference between the Yorktown as she left the surface and obviously potential major structural damage that might have occurred when she hit the seabed, because we see what's above the seabed, but not so much what's obviously below there. And we know, for example, with something like Bismarck, that although the hull of Bismarck, apart from having been smashed up by shells, looks generally relatively intact above the mud, we know from the diving reports that basically almost everything below that level has been smashed up and pulverized into a pancake. Now, if that's happened with Yorktown, this is going to be a much bigger problem than if it hasn't, or if it's only happened to a relatively small degree. And that's obviously all depends on how hard she landed. And did she drop straight down? Did she come in at an angle? How steep of that angle was it? How fast was that? How soft or hard was the seabed that she landed on, etc., etc. I think that, to be honest, if I was given an unlimited check to salvage Yorktown, that would be my single biggest concern. But let us assume that whatever damage she has sustained has not been enough to structurally compromise the ship to the point that she would just collapse when raised. The next thing you would have to work out is how much of the structure has potentially been compromised beyond the point of being able to stand up under its own weight by corrosion. Now, for those of you who watched the video I did with John Partial where we actually looked at the wreck, it doesn't appear as if she suffered from a huge amount of corrosion, certainly compared to something like Titanic. But of course, that is a relatively limited view on a submarine. We wouldn't know for sure until we were much more able to inspect the ship, and I suspect something like perhaps the island would be in a considerably worse state in terms of being able to stand up under its own weight now than maybe the main hull members, for example. But assuming that, again, you know, parts of the ship aren't just going to collapse like wet cardboard when she breaches the water, and we manage to get her into a dry dock, technically speaking, yes, we actually do have the technology. So if you reference the video that I did with the Mariners Museum, then you can see how they're preserving USS Monitor, which is in considerably worse state than USS Yorktown, or at least the bits of her Monitor that they've salvaged, because one, Monitor was made of iron, and two, it's been underwater for considerably longer. So given that we do know how to preserve a much more vulnerable material that is in a considerably worse baseline state, and we also have experience with preserving other more steel artifacts like swords and armour and some other artifacts that have been fished out of the water over time, we do know how to preserve and leach out the contaminants in steel. The only thing with Yorktown is that this would be being done on a scale hitherto completely unimagined in the field of preservation. I mean, even preserving Vasa and Mary Rose with polyethylene glycol, which wouldn't be applicable in this situation because Yorktown's not made of wood, or at least everything that's not the flight deck isn't. But Vasa and Mary Rose, you could stick both of them on Yorktown's flight deck with quite a disturbing amount of space to spare. This would be a huge ship, but in theory, if you had an old dry dock that no one needed to use anymore, and this was your plan, and you had an unlimited budget, you could, in theory, essentially do pretty much what they did with Mary Rose and Vasa, which would be to build a gigantic shed over the dry dock. You bring Yorktown in, you set her up again, assuming that she's not going to collapse under her own weight through impact damage and decay over time. Then you pump out the dry dock, close up the front of your gigantic shed, and then you commence the chemical treatment. Now, that could take two forms. That could take a massive spray treatment, the way that they've preserved some ships and artifacts, like Mary Rose and Vasa, or you may need to immerse and electrolyze the ship, which is obviously what they're doing to the Iron of Monitor. If you're going with a spray treatment, then you're going to need some fairly adventurous, and I would suggest relatively small and lightweight people, to go inside the ship to set up hoses to spray the interior as well as the exterior. Conversely, if you're going to be doing an immersion treatment, then a dry dock isn't going to cut it, because Yorktown will be taller than the dry dock, at which point you'd have to presumably get the site of a dry dock and dig it out to be a really, really big tank, which you would then put it in. But the technology is there, you would just have to massively upscale it compared to what we've done so far. Clayton Bradish asks, is the early commander performance issues with the US Navy in World War II a result of no real sustained combat since the Civil War, technology and racial superiority issues aside? Well, you do have the Spanish-American War, and the US Navy did get caught up a bit on tactics, even if they weren't directly involved in really major battles in World War I. But in some ways, yes, you could make that argument, at least in as much as senior German and British officers certainly almost certainly would have seen some kind of action in the First World War. Indeed, some of them were in some fairly famous engagements at obviously lower ranks than they would be in the Second World War, as opposed to US officers who were of flag rank by the Second World War who didn't have that experience. So that in particular is probably a little bit of a weakness. For the regular enlisted, unless you're a really, really long-serving veteran or a senior petty officer, the chances of any of them, of the regular crew, having seen combat is equally unlikely in any of the major navies by the Second World War. But I think there's potentially two other areas that cause some of the problems, or the perception of problems. One of which is related in a way to the technological and racial superiority issues that you mentioned with set aside, and it's not directly because of them, but they influence it, and that is the risk of what I would term mirror matching. So obviously we've done a whole video series on the US Navy fleet problems, but one of the issues that came out of that, I think, when you look at US Navy tactics in the Second World War, certainly in the first part of their engagement in said war, is that whilst the fleet problems were definitely worth doing, I'm not derogating them on that ground, the slight problem that you're going to have, especially when you have a navy where, as we said, no one has really actually seen combat in a full-scale war at any rank, is that you can end up with one playbook and you have both sides playing from that playbook, which means you're very good at spotting the strengths and weaknesses of your own playbook and potentially designing counters to them, which is fine assuming you were going to have a civil war, but not so fine if you're going to face an enemy that has a completely different playbook. So you go in there and, well, we know that this works and this doesn't, and in fact it might be the other way around against a different enemy. So carrier tactics, for example, the US Navy, as a result of legitimate results in their war games, has decided at the start of the war that the carriers should operate independently to enhance their survivability, whereas the Japanese have adopted the group everybody together and launch strikes much faster by only launching part of each carrier's complement as a strike. That's actually a superior solution, but both solutions are arrived at by the two navies engaging in exercises with very different perimeters and very different initial playbooks. Plus, of course, the Japanese have got a small amount of experience, at least in launching strikes, off of China, which the US doesn't. And I think that could lead to a certain amount of tactical inflexibility to start with, because when you combine the racial issues with the combat experience, you have senior British officers, for example, or German officers, where both sides know that the other mains opposition, Britain and Germany, they know that the other navy can fight well and come up with unexpected tactics. And, it is the early part of the 20th century. Both of those nations are white, or European. So therefore, it's much easier for them to accept, yeah, of course, those guys can fight and fight in weird ways. And we've seen how that works. And therefore, you can have Royal Navy officers, let's say, in interwar exercises are going, well, what if I fight like a German? Which gives a little bit more of a different experience for the people undergoing the exercise. Whereas for the US, aside from the fact they don't think the Japanese can innovate as well as them, because they haven't faced anyone specifically in direct combat, they have one step removed in terms of learning how those people fight. Because it's one thing to read about what another navy might or might not do in a book. It's another thing to have actually experienced that and intuitively therefore understand what they were doing and why. But I also think it's important not to completely overblow this issue, because yes, obviously the US Navy did suffer a number of major reverses in 1942. However, part of the reason that it can sometimes look so bad is because the US Navy was pretty much thrown immediately into a straight-up frontline confrontation with another major navy, and obviously, they weren't ready for it in some ways. But when you look at what's going on in 1941, late 41 and early 42 in, say, the Mediterranean or the Atlantic, it seems like the Kriegsmarine, the Regiermarine, and the Royal Navy are much more on the ball. But that's because those navies, well, the Regiermarine not so much, but certainly the Kriegsmarine and the Royal Navy, have already at that stage been at war for the better part of 2.5 years, going on to 3 years as you go through from 1942. Which means a lot of their awful mistakes have happened earlier. And in some ways, they had a grace period of a, relatively speaking, at least in most areas, slow build-up, which meant that sometimes they could make screw-ups and not quite get stung for them quite as badly. So, you look at the screw-ups that are the loss of HMS Courageous, the loss of HMS Glorious, the Narvik disaster for the Germans, and so on and so forth. When you look at that stuff, the stuff that's happening in the first year of the war in Europe, and compare it to the stuff that's happening in the first year of the war in the Pacific, on both sides, because the Japanese do make a few stuff-ups themselves, then you realize, okay, some of this is just, this Navy, regardless of what combat experience its flag officers might have had, it just hasn't been at war with modern technology as it stands at the end of the 1930s. And it's a learning experience. And initially, stuff-ups are going to happen. And you're going to get hurt by them. But then you learn and you move on. So when you take that into account, yes, still to varying degrees, as was admitted by senior US officers at the time, the US Navy was not as ready as it should have been, but it does mitigate some of the worse disasters a little bit. DM Phoenix asks, is there any particular reason why foreign-procured warships would have not only their ship name changed, but the class name as well? For example, the Fletchers were renamed Zestorer 1 class in Zestorer 1 class in West Germany, Fante class in Italy, Ariake class in Japan. In this specific case, I'm not aware of any substantial changes spec-wise that would justify changing a class name. Well, over time, each of those types that you listed did receive various fit-outs which diverged them from standard Fletcher class armament, whatever standard Fletcher class armament was by the Cold War. So, there's mixtures of 3-inch guns, or various numbers of 3-inch guns, or in the case of the Ariakes not having those, you've got weapon alpha, which was found on some but not the others. Various numbers of 5-inch guns were removed, so some had more and some had less. Torpedoes were sometimes removed, and sometimes other torpedoes, anti-submarine torpedoes, were added in. So if you look at the final weapons loadouts, or even the mid-career when they're in foreign service, weapons loadouts of each of those three classes, they have varied enough, I think, to justify calling them subclasses. And at that point, if they're going to be subclasses, well, then the subclass is going to be named after, the ship as it is called at the time, rather than its former name. But also, just on a more general basis, when a ship class enters service with another navy or a group of ships of the same class, generally speaking, well, whenever any class of ships enters service, they are named after the first in class. And you see this in World War II. You have captain class frigates in the Royal Navy, but they go under a different name in the US Navy, where functionally identical ships are listed as destroyer escorts. You have, as covered recently, the various Wicks, Clemson and Caldwell destroyers lumped together under town-class destroyers when they're transferred over to the Royal Navy. And in reverse, a pair of River-class frigates sent to the US Navy became the Asheville class, and their descendants, which were therefore theoretically should have been a subclass of the River class, became the Tacoma class, of which some, rather confusingly, were then given to the Royal Navy, where they became the Colony class as opposed to becoming River class again. But there you go. So essentially, it's just generally established practice that if a bunch of ships moves from one navy to another, they tend to give them a local name, usually based on the first in class, but if they don't have that, then some kind of other designation similar to that, perhaps reflecting the naming convention of that class. Rebel Squirrel asks, there is a quote attributed to Dwight D. Eisenhower, "The sergeant is the army." Could the same also be said of a Navy's non-commissioned officers in terms of their relative importance to both commissioned officers and ratings alike? Yeah, pretty much. Essentially, the NCOs or petty officers of any Navy are pretty much its backbone, because they're the ones who have the experience in their fields, the long-term experience, to actually know not only how things work and how they don't work, but also how things should work, as compared to younger officers who might, commissioned officers this is, who might know how something theoretically should work, but the petty officers will know, or the non-commissioned officers will know how it actually works. And that could be anything from, say with technical stuff of, a newly commissioned lieutenant or lieutenant, depending on which navy you're in, might go, well, this is a radar. I have to press this button and switch this switch, and then it comes on. And the NCO might go, yeah, in theory, yes, sir, that is the case. However, with this particular unit, you need to give it a good sharp kick in the corner just here, and actually you need to switch this on first, then hit the button, then flip the other switch, and then it'll work. Why does it work that way? Nobody knows, but it does. And likewise for newly enlisted, of course, the NCOs have vastly more experience about how everything should work, not just in technical terms, but also in camaraderie, how you obey orders, how you respond to things. They're just a massive body of experience, knowledge, and to a certain extent, even shortcuts. And that's what keeps the Navy going. They pass their knowledge on to the younger enlisted, who some of them might eventually ascend to the heady ranks of Chief Petty Officer or similar, and they provide an interface between the said enlisted and the officers, and they're usually the ones who can tell the officers, yes, sir, I know you want that done, sir, but translating that into actually effectively something occurring could prove a little bit difficult. Perhaps if Sir wishes to modify said order to this very similar thing that fulfills the spirit but not the technicality, but will actually result in something happening that's not detrimental to the ship, then things might go quicker. Yeah, that's a very short summary of why you definitely need to listen to your NCOs. Because after all, a young officer newly commissioned with a map in the army usually at worst will get you lost. A newly commissioned officer in the Navy who's trying his hand at navigation and doesn't listen to his petty officers may end up with a very expensive ship on a very, very unmovable rock, which is a slightly larger consequence. Jim Smitty asks, while digging around for information on Novaya Zemlya, maybe, I ran across a reference to Operation Wunderland and the Kriegsmarine operating in the Kara Sea in 1942. This came as something as a surprise to me, as I'd never heard about it before. Given I could only find a limited amount of information on this sortie by the Germans, can you give us a good idea of what happened and what the Germans were hoping to achieve here, and how did the Allies not get into a position to sink the Admiral Scheer, which was flagship of the operation? Essentially, the Germans were hoping to disrupt supply operations that the Soviets were running along their northern coast. The reasons why the Germans went for this instead of trying to go and do more Atlantic raiding is because they'd been forbidden from doing Atlantic raiding with large ships, and then fuel shortages cut down what should have been a larger deployment to just the Admiral Scheer and some U-boats, who actually ended up being more successful than the Scheer. And the whole thing was done in August at the height of summer, because obviously the northern Russian coast is usually quite heavily packed with ice, and by sailing in towards the end of summer, it gave maximum sea room because the ice had retreated as much as it was realistically ever going to. The short version is essentially the German forces set out. Obviously, Scheer had an Arado 196 it could use for scouting, and they found a few Russian ships and managed to sink them, although, as I said, the U-boats did better at that and also at the shelling part than Scheer did. The idea ultimately was to find a rumoured major Soviet port that had been built up and destroy it. That didn't work out quite as well as they'd hoped. But in terms of why the Allies weren't in a position to sink the Scheer, and, well, that's related to why the Germans went for this operation at all, which is that this happened, as you said, in 1942, but it happened in the aftermath, a few months after, PQ-17. So at this point, the Allies had suspended Arctic convoys for the duration of the summer of 1942 because of what happened to PQ-17, at which point the ships that were operating in the area that the Germans went after were going to be purely Soviet merchant ships and a handful of warships that belonged to the Soviet Northern Fleet, which at the time was pretty small. I mean, bear in mind, towards the end of the war, the Northern Fleet had to be strengthened by giving it town-class destroyers, i.e. ex-US Navy 4-stackers. The Russian Northern Fleet was at this point made up of a questionable collection of mostly old and obsolete destroyers. And therefore, something like Admiral Scheer had a pretty good chance of killing anything it came across, and without the Allied convoys running, that meant the larger numbers of Allied cruisers and destroyers and escorts that might sail with the Arctic convoys just simply weren't in the area. And even if the convoys had been running, battleships and fleet carriers wouldn't have really been an issue because the Scheer sailed far, far further east than the Allies were comfortable in sending major capital assets at this stage of the war. Don't Look Down the Barrel of a Loaded Cannon asks, what was considered the worst generic at-sea assignment for a Royal Navy officer during the Napoleonic era? And by generic, I mean not a supposedly cursed ship or a notoriously bad captain, etc. Was it simply any assignment that offered little or no prospect of battle and therefore little possibility of critical experience for advancement? Boring long-distance patrol assignments were not particularly well favoured because of, well, it's going to be very boring, it's difficult to keep discipline when everyone's very bored and so forth. But that wasn't necessarily considered the worst. Generally speaking, the worst assignment that you could be given as just a generic one, as you mentioned, would be anything to do with patrolling or serving in the tropics. So the Caribbean, especially west coast of Africa, almost anywhere in the Indian Ocean, although the northern parts of it slightly less so. And that's for one very simple reason: tropical diseases. I mean, coupled with that, most people from the UK don't do tremendously well in prolonged tropical heat, especially back in those days. Can you imagine having to spend weeks or months in tropical heat whilst, as an officer, certainly being expected to wear a traditional 18th century, mostly woolen uniform? And of course, apart from the disease issue, this is an era before anybody has refrigeration, so all your food supplies are going to be spoiling pretty darn quickly. Your consumption of liquids is going to be going up, and that means you're going to have to put in for resupply considerably more often, which gives even more chances for those fantastic tropical diseases to get on board. I mean, there's a reason that, for example, when the Royal Navy launches various campaigns in the Caribbean, between the Navy and the Army, the vast majority of casualties are actually caused by disease, not by the enemy. So simply on the grounds of you're going to be hot, sweaty, miserable, probably eating rotting food, and there's a higher chance that you're going to keel over and die from some tropical illness that no one's ever heard of before, and certainly even if they do, they don't have a cure for. You do not want a tropical assignment in the Royal Navy. At least certainly not at that point. These days, of course, they have aircon when it works, and refrigeration, which usually works, but, and we've got inoculations and so forth. But certainly in the 18th century, stay away from the Caribbean if at all possible. And finally, US Navy Sailor asks, we see a lot of information about torpedo defense systems designed into battleship hulls, and to a lesser extent aircraft carriers. Were there any efforts to design some sort of mitigating defense into any other classes' hulls? I'm thinking maybe heavy cruisers or anything with a somewhat large hull. Outside of things with comically large bulges like monitors, generally speaking, no torpedo defense systems in the way that you would think of them in battleships and carriers. And that's for one primary reason, and that is beam. So if you've been on various museum ships, if you've been on a museum destroyer or a museum cruiser, and then you go on a museum battleship, apart from general scale, one of the single biggest things that you will notice is just how wide battleships are in comparison with anything else, except for obviously aircraft carriers. And that applies even to something like, say, USS Salem, a really big Des Moines class cruiser. She's still, 30 feet narrower than most battleships of her time period. The Baltimore class, which you can see in this picture, is narrower again. And when you get back to pre-war heavy cruisers, stuff that's trying to obey the treaty limits, they're narrower again, sometimes up to 20 feet narrower than a Des Moines, which means they're up to 50 feet narrower than some of the wider beam battleships. And ultimately, if you want a torpedo defense system, what you need is depth. If you put a battleship scale torpedo defense system on a cruiser, it would pretty much almost entirely be torpedo defense systems. In fact, they might even meet in the middle. And the thing is, in theory, yes, you can scale them down to give you a bit of room to stick the machinery in. But one, then you won't be going very fast because your machinery space will be tiny. And two, you're not really going to have a huge amount of success with that because torpedoes tend to come in set sizes. So if you get hit by a submarine-launched torpedo, it doesn't matter if you're a destroyer, a cruiser, a battleship, or a carrier, that torpedo is still coming at you with exactly the same amount of explosive. And so if you have, let's say, a torpedo defense system capable of resisting 300 pounds of explosive, you might as well not have it, because there's almost zero torpedoes out there in the Second World War, for example, with only 300 pounds of explosive on board. And so when you get hit, it's going to blow straight through that torpedo defense system. You're going to have massive flooding anyway. And in the space that your completely ineffective torpedo defense system did exist, you could have had other stuff like, say, more powerful engines, which might have allowed you to get out of the way of the torpedo in the first place. The absolute largest cruisers, so things like the Alaskas or the Des Moines for that matter, did have a small degree of spacing internally to try and give some protection against underwater explosions. But it wasn't really seen as a defense against torpedoes. It was more seen as a defense against smaller mines, nearby bomb explosions, and maybe premature detonating torpedoes, or the very smallest airdropped torpedoes. And that's on the absolute largest cruisers. It wasn't in any way, shape, or form thought to be of practically any use against a heavy surface-launched or subsurface-launched weapon. There were some mitigation measures built in, like having the unit system of machinery and a lot of subdivision, but that in and of itself has its own compromises, so that's not necessarily found on all ships of cruiser size and down. Or if it is present, it's present in different quantities, again, depending on the design, the ship, the year, the nation, etc. But realistically, if you're a destroyer or a cruiser and you take a hit amidships from a big torpedo, your odds are not really particularly good. On the other hand, both destroyers and cruisers tend to have relatively fine bows and, relatively speaking, fine sterns, which is why a lot of them do sometimes survive having those bits blown off of them. But a body blow amidships, you're lucky if you survive that. In part because no matter how well you subdivide it, the machinery spaces are always going to be your biggest spaces, and they tend to be amidships. Whereas a battleship, taking a blow amidships, that's where the torpedo defense is strongest, so actually a battleship might be able to eat several torpedoes amidships, assuming they don't arrive in very quick succession in almost exactly the same spot. And that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Hope you've enjoyed the channel updates recently, and hope to see you again in another video.